Welcome to Gatecrashers, a podcast dedicated to kicking open the door to your next favorite thing. Our mission, our creed, and our code is this: to make all things more approachable and accessible to everyone. We want you to find a universe that you'll fall in love with. Today, I am joined by an absolute powerhouse of talent. You may know their work when they were an editor at Vertigo. They have gone on to become an Eisner and Harvey Award-winning writer of books such as The Good Asian, Infidel Man's Best, Dead Boy Detectives, and many more. But today we are here to talk about taking a chance with the Horizon Experiment with Pornsak Pichetshote. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. I did have Green Arrow Flashpoint in there, but I was like,
wow,
maybe I won't throw that one in there because again, you blew up when The Good Asian came out. It was like it was it's still one of the best books.
Oh, thank you.
In our industry. I kept saying to myself, I feel like I've read one of his books before, and I'm racking my brain, and I remember I back when Flashpoint came out is when I started really reading comics. And I bought the entire run, everything.
Wow,
it stuck.
You were a completist. You were one of those completists.
It was just like a deal our store had that if you got it, you got all the cool buttons or something.
I remember that.
Yeah. Some of the books were wild.
Yes, they were. That was my very first comic, which I don't talk about a lot because I feel like you can see me on the page learning the do's and don'ts of writing comics.
But that's really okay because some people get started their own thing. You started with Green Arrow, so
yeah.
What are they going to say to you? You'd be like, it's Green Arrow. I did it first. But
appreciate that.
Horizon Experiment.
Yes.
I won't take up all of our time talking about how fucking cool this idea is. All right, I don't want to explain for you. Do you want to give an elevator pitch of what the Horizon Experiment itself is?
Sure. So the Horizon Experiment are 5 one-shot pilots for potential new series. Depending on sales and reception, we will do more, but if not, we won't. And it's 5 creators of color, of all friends of mine, who I kind of gave them the same challenge, which was create a protagonist from a marginalized background who set the story in a popular genre, and set the story in such a way that if you change the background of the character, the whole thing would have to change. And from that, we've got 5 one-shot pilots. The first one that comes out September 25th is The Manchurian by me and comics royalty Terry and Rachel Dodson, and that's about a half Chinese, half English, half Caucasian super spy working covert missions in America for China. We have Sabir Pirzada from Marvel Studios and Lucasfilms, and the Eisner-winning Micheal Walsh doing The Sacred Dams, which is about a Muslim exorcist, or a Muslim John Constantine, and we've started referring to her. We have Tanana Rivdu, who's a novelist who's won literally every single award. Stephen King just recommended her latest novel on PBS. So if you're a horror fan, you get no better accolade than that. And she's teaming up with newcomer Kelsey Ramsey to do a book called Moondogs, which is about East African werewolves secretly living in Miami in a story that's focusing on about being a minority within a minority. Jay Holtham, that hails from the Emmy-winning The Handmaid's Tale, is working with an indie cartoonist, Michael Lee Harris, to do Motherfucking Monsters, which is the Evil Dead for blurs, for black nerds. And then we have Comics' own Vita Ayala, who's worked on everything great in comics, and Skylar Patridge, who is this complete rising star, a complete powerhouse. Yes. And they are combined together on their first career-owned title to do a book called Finders Keepers, which is a reverse Indiana Jones, someone who steals from museums to return artifacts back to their native cultures. And that is the Horizon Experiment. There's 5 one-shot pilots. If people are interested in it, tell their stores, order them, pick them up at the store, and sales will dictate if we do more or not.
I have reread the pitch page on the first page of The Manchurian probably a few times now, just because there's so much going. I think you may be one of the only people who I read all of the backup stuff,
cool.
The back matter, because you have little nuggets in here, and I've got some to talk about. But this line is so bold. I have the image up of all 5 covers next to each other.
Yeah.
nothing, not a single one of these books looks like one another. Like there's so much creativity going on here. I am beyond excited for motherfucking monsters.
Thank you. That yeah. And it looks like nothing else too.
Yeah.
That looks like, Michael Lee Harris, his style is so unique and so like distinct that and he does some simple stuff that like he uses color in his gutters, which I've never seen before. And because of that, he'll call out, he'll do like a call out panel and just do color around an image to turn that into its own panel. There are these little techniques that he does that, like reading comics for, God, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years, however long it's been, I've never seen anyone do before. And he's such a fresh voice. And so I'm so excited for people to discover what he and Jay are working on.
I didn't think I could be more excited, but you started talking about the gutters. Like it's such an underutilized space.
Yeah.
Oh, and the colors on all of these books are so good.
Yeah.
But
yeah, we've got the artistic talent has been fantastic. Everyone, that's one of the things I love. Everyone just really showed up to the experience, and and they're just swinging for the fences, which is amazing.
That's what we need more of in comics now.
Yeah,
you have talked about how you had this conversation, like this conversation spurred all of this.
Oh yeah,
what was it? It was that conversation like one-on-one, like were you out with getting drinks? Like how do you and your artsy friends like talk about this kind of stuff?
That's the thing. It wasn't my artsy friends. It's my friends who don't work in the arts, who we were just hanging out, talking about sort of like James Bond. I mean, I don't think there's any, I unfortunately can't frame it in any way that is very unique, because I feel like everyone who's had that conversation basically has the same conversation. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's a very generic conversation. The only unique thing that kind of came from it was this realization that just like, oh man, I would love to see Idris Elba play a British super spy, but like I would want to see what it's like for a black man to be a British super spy. That sounds awesome. And that sounds awesome. And I just, the Broccolis will never make that movie. They'll never make that version of James Bond. And that's the one I want the most. And so and that kind of, that started the whole domino, sort of tipping down. Yeah. And going from there.
You use the phrase colorblind casting, and like really that the idea really stuck with me, because I'm looking at all these things in this line. What do you think is lost when you do something like that? When you just make the character, like anyone can play this character, but you don't bring a unique background to it.
Well, I think it's not necessarily that something is lost. It's just there are options you just don't get to explore, right? There's a specificity that just you don't get to access. And I think the one shots themselves actually show some of that specificity that you don't get. Like I'm proud of all of them, and they each push at things in different ways, right? Like the Sacred Dam. The thing I loved about Sacred Dam is that people who respond to it for the same reason I did. Because when you hear about it, you're just like, wait a minute, that's right. I've seen a ton of exorcism and possession stories. They're all from the Catholic Christian point of view. There are so many other faiths in the world that believe in demonology, believe in possession, and I've never heard those stories. Why haven't I heard any of those stories? And all of a sudden, this genre that I love just suddenly gets exploded open, right? And it starts from that specificity, and you realize there's so much more there. Where it's a little bit of like, without that specificity, everything it just feels small in comparison, Like Tananari's book Moondogs is about being a minority within a minority. And then you're like, oh, wow, that's such a specific experience. But at the same time, you can kind of relate to it in different ways, but you only get it by sort of being specific. Similarly, like a book about, a Chinese spy and how, Chinese espionage is different from Western espionage. You can only get that if you have a Chinese sort of protagonist, So like, there's just all these pockets of stories that we are missing out on and it's one of the first things that you think about when you're talking about when you're writing is that specificity opens stories up, it doesn't close them. And so just by being specific in this way, it just introduces so many more stories.
Yeah, and with like the Sacred Damned, having that specificity of like, this isn't demonology, what we normally see, like with like the Exorcist and things like that. It inverts it, and that person isn't the hero. They're seen as a villain, but they're like by the people who should accept them. And it's such an interesting, that book ruled. Both of these books so far have been great. I'm so excited to read the rest, but this is the whole idea behind it is very experimental. And we've seen some more experimental things in comics recently with, funny enough, Silver Coin, Michael Walsh, who's doing Sacred Damned, had his book where he's doing art and different writers are coming in. And like, it's just like playing with, just like the idea of comics that you have a different partner every time, got razor blades, those types of things. What made you want to go out on a limb to put these 5 one-shots out to be like, here's our pilot season? What do you like?
I think it was just honestly, it started off with, this was something, I kind of made the same pitch to everybody. It's just like, this sounds like something worth doing. This is something that we could pull off. And I think we could pull off, it's worth doing. I think we should just do it. And that's really sort of the spirit of it all. A lot of it is, it's funny to me because yes, the Horizon experiment is just that, is an experiment. But at the same time, it goes back to the roots of comics, like literally this entire industry is built off of things that came off of one shots. Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy 15, issues of Showcase, all of that, Action Comics. They were so like 99% of the stuff that, built this industry that we're now all kind of like standing upon came from one-off stories that people were just creating, and then they found there was an audience and they just went from there. So in a lot of ways, this goes back to the roots of comics, of just trying and experimenting and getting back to a little bit of like, I feel like now there's so much curation in comics. There's so much about making this curated sound where, and a lot of this is practical. Like you have to have a business plan. You need X number of books. If you're doing superhero line, it's got to do all these sort of things. But I think that what got all of us into comics were just like these crazy concepts that were just sort of out there that we couldn't find on TV or movies or anything like that, that you only could find on the comics page because people were taking those kind of chances, which I kind of feel like it's not as prominent as it was, because I feel like everyone is, or not everyone, but too many people are thinking about like, but like, I want to sell this as a movie one day. I want to sell this as a TV show. And just like, as opposed to just create to create. And that's kind of at the heart what the Horizon experiment is about. But it's also looking at like, wow, these are all people who, should be doing more in comics. They should be doing more stuff that's about their voice, that to showcase their individual voice, to open things up. Because I think comics would really benefit from that, and in the process attract like these different groups of people who kind of want to see material like this. So it's all those things kind of coming together.
I love this whole mission statement is just like what I want more of. I just want people to take chances and not be IP farms, because it hurts seeing these books and it's like, oh, it's sold for a movie. It's like, I'm so happy you're getting your bag. Like, I'm so happy you're getting paid. But like, was that the goal? Like, were you doing this just to sell it? Like, I get it, but sometimes there's a thin line. But you talked a lot about like the roots of comics, and every time people want to talk about promoting comics and getting them into people's hands, they always go, oh, put them back in grocery stores and all that kind of stuff. And it's just not practical. So you're taking the chance with these 5 one-shots. What has it been like promoting this book for you? Because it's not like an organic audience. It's mostly off of your five cast's talents. Yeah.
I mean, I think, a lot of it is it's very organic in the sense of we're each taking what we know, the resources that we have, and we're talking about it and getting the word about it sort of as much as we can. And, as experimental as the project is itself, every aspect of the execution is experimental as well. There are little bits of the production where it's just like, shoot, I guess we have to do something different this time. Or like, I'm constantly sort of like discovering that, and we are all across the board. So I think a lot of it though is, it's organic, but it's also very logical. So like, I don't think we're doing anything, I mean, and even the concept of like a bunch of people who know each other getting together to promote each other's book, that's not like a universe shattering concept. But so all we're just really doing is we're just using the resources we have to talk about the book as much as possible and get the word out about other people, all the other books that are sort of part of of the line. And that's really, and just trying to bang the drum as much as possible. I also think too that like I think we've all been really grateful at just how much people have responded to the intention of the whole thing, that so many people have gone on board who kind of want to do that. And again, we'll see what it what it looks like in terms of sales and all that kind of stuff, and hopefully people show up there. But yeah, it's a weird thing to promote only because it is different. So any piece, like I was just thinking this today, it's like, oh, I didn't promote this the way I normally do. It's like, oh, but I can't because it's 5 separate one shots by 5 different people. But then I'm like, is that like the special sauce that was the reason why the promotion worked on the last thing? I don't know. So it's been endlessly fascinating how like even little things are experiments all the way through, and we'll just sort of take it from there.
Are you, and I assume you're collecting that data like at the end to like kind of see, I mean, it's not the end yet. So
yeah,
you're like digesting what's worked so far. So it's something that I noticed when I was reading Infidel is a lot of the quotes in it. I'm looking through them as I'm reading, and I've been doing comic stuff for about 5 years. I didn't know half the sites, and I was like, this is a market, like the press and all that kind of stuff. It's something that continuously turns over.
Yeah.
What has it been like you from promoting this book for something that isn't like a site like mine where we can freely talk about just whatever, like for something like a CBR or a comic books? How do you promote this for something like that? Like, how do you give it to a much larger audience?
I mean, I feel like it's kind of just the way sort of we've been doing it sort of in small bites. We had an ash can that we sent out to some sort of influencers and also to comic book retailers so that they can kind of take a look at it. I think there's a lot of social media that's sort of been a part of it. It is an interesting thing that you mentioned, because like when you think about, because it wasn't that long ago, like 2018, that was like what, 6 years ago? Yeah. When I released Infidel, right? But the landscape has changed so much. So like, when I was doing Infidel, all the promotion were written interviews. And now that has shifted to podcast interviews. And so now, now it's more podcast interviews. But then podcast interviews is a thing where like, oh, but you've got to make it fit into your schedule. It's an X number of time. Like coming from Infidel, like I had this thing down to a science where just like end of my day, I just rattle off my interview answers. Start of the day, I clean it up, send it out. With podcasts, you can't do that. It's a half hour. It's an hour. Yeah. Like you're committing. So like that becomes a different thing. And there's something, I don't know. I mean, I guess if I was a sales marketing person, I would hate this, but because coming more from creative aspect, there's something I appreciate about it kind of having to be different every time, and you're kind of having to adjust. And that's been the case for all my books, is that the landscape has been slightly different every time. So, and that's part of what I mean too, of just like, of this particular thing. Oh, I'm not doing as many podcasts as I did when I launched my previous books. But in total, about everyone doing a Horizon Experiment thing, we've done much more. And so then it's just like, but I'm not doing personally as much. So does that mean, is that going to break the, is that the lucky charm that's going to change the chain, everything? Like, I don't know. And I kind of keep telling myself there's just nothing like, this project is nothing like anything I've ever done. And I will also admit too, every time I have to promote a book, I find myself going like, how do people do this? I just forget, like I have that amnesia. Like I do interviews. I know, okay, I guess I do interviews. Is there something else I did last time that I forgot? And then I just stumble into it along the way.
Yeah, it's just a trial and error, really.
Yeah.
With this being five different groups, you texted the 5 people you wanted to start this project with.
Yeah.
From there, how did you build these teams out? Was it you and your editor finding these different people? Because you talked about the Dodsons, and your editor was like, why don't you just get the Dodsons?
Yeah. Well,
I could do that.
Yeah. No, a lot of it is just me and Will sort of talking. Some people have people they really wanted to work with. I'm trying to think, like, Terry Dodson was a very easy one where Will just said, why don't we just ask him? Sabir just like, well, who's the best horror artist you can give me? It's just like, why don't we start with the best horror artist working? Like, let's start with Michael Walsh. And he was on it. Like he loved it like from jump, you know? I think, I'm trying to think, Tananarive really wanted a Black female artist because the book is about a Black family and centered around a Black woman. So she wanted someone who could kind of like draw those faces accurately. And, you know, because some of the things sometimes you find it's like, it's an artist that draws like a white woman just with darker skin. And so she wanted like a little bit more accurate, specifically because, you know, it's like East African specifically. Mm-hmm. So, you know, so then we went looking, and then, you know, Kelsey, who went from like short story in like an anthology to Scott Snyder's curated line of books to Hellblazer, like that rise is so meteoric.
What a jump.
In the span of like 3 years she did that, and she's balanced all this like Moondogs. I think she did like a page or two a week on top of everything else she was doing because she was doing so much. Like she's a superstar, you know, and we just were able to catch her while her on a rise to the top. Yeah. You know, Jay Holtham had another specific, like he wanted, because it was comedic and because it involved Black characters, he also wanted a Black cartoonist, specifically a cartoonist, someone who could handle cartoony stuff. And he was just like, and his word was like, if it was anyone else Black, that stuff can dip into caricature and very, very easily if you're not careful. And Jay's like, I don't know how to give art notes to stop that. So like, if we can have like a Black artist who can work their way around that, I'd feel much better. So like, and then Michael Lee Harris had worked on, I think Will was the one who knew Michael Lee Harris's work because he had done an anthology that he had worked on. And when I saw it, I'm just like, this doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before. This is awesome. Let's do this. And then Vita was the one who brought Skylar on board because they had worked on Wonder Woman together, on Trial of the Amazons together. And they were just like, I'm dying to work on a create our own project with Skylar. And it's just like, oh no, done. And, you know, and then Skylar too is one of those ones who are just like constantly booked up and is like, so you know, and now, and now she's working with Mariko Tamaki, or has been working on Mariko Tamaki on Supergirl. Now they're doing an ongoing Supergirl thing. So like, so like everyone here is kind of a star.
Yeah, it's again just powerhouses of talent, and it's so nice to see books that are like not just white dudes. Like I don't know any other way around just saying it right there. Because again, the plot was like, let's do marginalized people and like their background to these popular things you don't get to see outside of people that look like me. And it's like, that sucks. So like hearing how much like goes into like making sure this is like not accurate, but like representative is awesome. Like I'm so excited to see all of these books.
Thank you. Because it was one of the things, like I remember this was a conversation with Tananarive and Vita too. Like they were very much like, hey, let's make sure we get the skin tones right. Because oftentimes, you know, Black people, their skin tones are too light, you know? And so, and the fear is always, oh, it will be too dark to print. But Vita's got all this experience. Like, it's not too dark to print. You can just print it that way. You do have to light, you know, I worked on a television show with Black protagonists, and you do have to light them differently, you know, to sort of pick up the highlights. And so it's kind of a similar thing with coloring of just kind of like, you know, you can't just like, you know, backlight everybody and, you know, like you got to sort of pay attention to that a little bit more.
Yeah. Cause there's something like characters like Storm, depends on who the colorist is, like what Storm looks like. And it's like, you gotta stick to who they are.
Yeah.
But now your book, The Manchurian, just a banger. Like it's so good.
Thank you.
The Dodds, like I love your writing. I love the Dodsons, and like I think in literally on the second page, they're not lonely or horny. I was like, all right, I'm in. I need this to go to series. But for you, like I'm just a white guy, like hearing and reading and learning more about like how spying is very different elsewhere. What kind of research did you do for all of this?
Well, the good news for The Manchurian was I had worked on a project previously that didn't go anywhere that was about Chinese espionage. So it was something that I kind of knew about already, and I had been playing sort of with this idea. It wasn't like The Good Asian where I had an idea and I had to do a bunch of research to fill in the blanks. This was something that I kind of already knew, and, you know, not a surprise. Chinese espionage is not a topic that they are very public about. So
Yeah.
as a result, there was a nice thing, I could do where I could build it on a foundation of truth, but then from there I could kind of build sort of mythology that, there was, it's no more accurate to what Chinese espionage actually is than James Bond is accurate to how MI6 works.
Yeah.
But it gets to be in that vein of just larger than life and just, involving beautiful people doing exciting things in cool locales. And that's why it made like someone like Terry like a no-brainer. It was one of the like exciting things that you get to experience when you're an editor, where you're just like, oh, these people do all these things, but they've never done it before in one thing, like Terry had done a spy book before, but that was kind of like a superhero spy book in Red One, but she hadn't done like a James Bond kind of spy book thing. But he's perfect for it. So we were just kind of like, oh my God, like
yes.
let's do that. Let's do that. Let's do it with Terry.
The Dodsons are just, there's a lot about this book. I don't want to spoil anything because I do want people to really get into it. There is a page. It's an email.
Yes.
I was curious, is this something? So who designs a page like this? Is it the artist? Is it you? Is it the letterer? Who designs a page that's all background of like headlines, and then in front of it's an email box, which is it's a very stunning like page, especially when you have you're reading it digital and not like on paper.
Yeah.
It's like,
oh right, sure. I didn't even think about that. That was my idea to do the email, and then it was my letterer/designer Jeff Powell, who works on all my books, and we kind of talked back and forth about like how to make it just look as graphic as possible. And I can't remember which one of us had the idea of like the headlines in the background to kind of add an extra layer of information. But it was also too, part of it was, the concept for anyone not familiar with Chinese espionage is different from Western espionage in that the Chinese espionage, they go through something that the FBI describe. They do something in the FBI describes as 1,000 grains of sand philosophy. Whereas if in the West, if you want to get sand from a beach, you get an elite frogman in the cover of night to go stealth their way onto that beach, smuggle all the sand, and then come back. But China would get 1,000 tourists to walk onto that beach in the broad daylight, in the middle of the day where everyone can see them. And then they would come home and they would all shake out the sand out of their boots and out of their shoes. And they would get as much sand, if not more, than your elite frogman in the middle of the night. And that is the analogy they use for espionage. It is not, nobody goes in and steals anything. Nobody breaks any laws. Everyone just gets little bits of gossip that they've heard, bring it all together, and then someone pieces together what the truth actually is. And that's how Western espionage works. It's corporate espionage. And that was a piece of research I had done looking into Chinese espionage that I thought was sort of fascinating. And from there came the mythology of the Manchurian, this character who's kind of a fixer, who, because you can't have your spies committing any crimes, you have someone who's out there whenever they have problems, they can go to this person that will take care of whatever problems that they have. And that is the concept of that. And so that email became a really efficient way and graphic way of getting all that information across.
I really love. I sometimes have a problem with like data pages in books because like my brain only remembers images, not words. But this is like done in a way that is so visually appealing that it has stuck with me since I closed the book.
Cool, thank you.
It's so sick. And
thank you.
If I had read this in any other condition, I may have tried to scroll on the wheel for the email. Now you basically got to create your own James Bond, like your own super spy character. Yeah. What did you do that with the Dodsons, or was that something like you came with like notes of like, this is kind of what I'm thinking? How did that all go down? Because
I had notes in terms of, I had rough notes in terms of like the concept of the character, and I needed to have actors in mind just more for reference in terms of like, for Terry, like, this is what a Hapa, this is what someone Hapa looks like. This is, and I kind of gave him a range of like famous Hapa actors. So he could see the range of how Caucasian they look, how Asian they look, and all that. But Terry really did sort of take it from there and very much sort of made it his own. I think if you're a fan of Terry's stuff, he's got a great sense of fashion, and so I love the way his characters dress. So he definitely added that sort of, the aspect to it. And yeah, and he just kind of gave his touch on just designing the characters and all that.
Super beautiful characters, great design, all that cool. The thing that stuck out the most is this fake mustache.
Yeah,
that shows up a couple times. It's so good.
yeah. That was definitely a Terry. I think I gave like some kind of like suggestion on that, and then Terry really went and went with it.
Now, this book, the FOC closes on September 2nd. So people, if you're listening, please pre-order this one. It'll let your shop know that you want it, but it'll also show that there's interest for the book. Pre-ordering is very, very, very important to and it's also important to DC and Marvel books, but it's way more important for smaller books to get the light they need. Now, I want to talk about something that I noticed when I was rereading a lot of your stuff.
Okay.
The concept of good. The word itself comes up quite a lot. I mean,
that's so interesting.
The good Asian is there, but in this, they often talk about how they are good people. Like they're not, oh, here it's like a good woman, like a good man. Like it's a concept of good. Like, what does good mean? And even in Infidel, like the grandmother, there's something very particular about how you write. I don't want to say race politics or anything like that, but like perspective. You write from what I have been reading. There is a 360 type of perspective you take towards situations. What is the exploration of the word good or the idea of good something that has ever been like something you've dug into, or is it something you just find that pops up as you're writing?
That is a really, really good question. That is a really, really good question. I think it's a concept that pops up a lot in my work, but also pops up a lot in my life. I feel like too, I think it is this question sort of decency. I have been someone who's lived in the corporate world of entertainment for a while now, and so there is a lot of, can you be good and still be great? And I've had the fortune of being able to sit ringside seats to a lot of cautionary tales. So I feel like because of that, I do think that is something specific for me that I feel like finds different ways to sort of pop up in the work. Good in the good Asian definitely is in terms of sort of respectability politics. Good in Manchurian is different, where it really is just sort of about like, what is the power of decency and what is the power of looking out for your neighbor and community, even though it's done in this warped way of an espionage book where it's against American interests, but it's meant to sort of look at all that sort of stuff. It's interesting. Good for Infidel is very much in the eye of the beholder, and it's like, and all that. So it's not something I've really stopped. It's not something I've really stopped to think about in my work. It's a really interesting question to get, but it is something I think about in my life, I guess, which is probably why it filters into my work in all the ways that it does.
I think most people want to live in a way that they can, at the end of the day, say they are a good person. But I love how it just keeps popping up, and it's just something I've noticed and kind of dug into as I'm reading this. I'm like, I
appreciate that.
I love the continuing theme. I mean, you're a person, you have beliefs and you have ideas, and those will always bleed into things. But just that word, I've just been like, okay, there's a reason it's there.
Now I'm gonna think about it all the time now.
Sorry to give you a complex. Now we talked about a lot the experiment. Let's talk. I just want to talk a little bit about horror and some of your own things. Now, in Infidel, in your first kind of opening, you talk about how horror has been trapped in amber. Like how horror is kind of like it was in this spot in 2018. Fast forward to today. What do you see horror as a landscape as today versus what it was when you were making Infidel?
Well, one of the things that I think is fascinating is when I did Infidel, there weren't a ton of horror comics out there. Like, I think people have taken for granted the explosion of horror comics in the past 6 years. And a lot of that credit is given, a lot of that it should be credited to Some Things Killing the Children being the powerhouse that it is. But that is, when I start Infidel, I do this for all my books. When I'm working on a new book, I have a bunch of comics that I haven't read yet, because I have like a wall of comics I haven't read yet. And I keep my reference of like, oh, let's read the stuff that's going to be applicable to like the genre I'm working on. It was so hard to find horror comics, man. It was just like, you have stuff like The Walking Dead, but that wasn't really a horror comic. At a certain point that became a different thing.
Yeah.
There were so many comics that just, their intent was not to scare you. And so it was like few and far between that I would get to. And now I have an entire long box dedicated to horror comics I haven't gotten around to reading yet. Like, not the horror comics I own, I just haven't gotten around to reading yet. There are so many. So it's such an explosion. So I've been really kind of blown away by that, I think, it's certainly one of the things we benefit from Infidel. We're kind of like the second sort of horror of color to come out after Get Out. And so we got a lot of like Get Out for comics sort of comparisons, and you would get a lot of, and we would see that in movies specifically about like, more stuff about horror, about specific communities and all that. So we're seeing sort of more in that. One of the things that I've been kind of shocked we haven't started seeing more of, which I tried to do in Infidel, was that the Infidel really wanted there to be a multiracial cast where we actually like dove into the differences their different races like brought to the table. And I've been kind of shocked we haven't seen much of that at all in sort of the 6 years or since. It's been very siloed. It
is interesting to see that. Again, that's why I think it was so like refreshing to read it, because I'm constantly reading these books, talking about these books and things like that. Like, two things that stuck, other than the 360 perspective, that's one of the things. The other thing that stood out to me is that there wasn't a fear to kill a character. Like, and it happens pretty early. Like, there is major characters that like you don't. I was sitting in bed with my fiance. My mouth was open when the stairs happened. I, as a reader, was not prepared for someone to be like, and then the two most quote unquote vulnerable, the oldest and the youngest, they're down the steps. I'm like, holy shit. This is not like anything else I'm reading. Do you think there is a fear for writers in these ongoing kind of horror books to kill these characters?
I think ongoing horror is the toughest type of horror, I feel like, because you kind of have to keep that machine going, and how do you keep the machine going, and all that kind of stuff. And also too, there is always the like, once you know what the threat is, how do you maintain, ongoing horror turns into thriller very quickly, because you get used to the scares, you get used to the threats. So I think that's the problem in general. And then, I feel like, it's an interesting thing, because when we think about horror, we have to remember that, we're mostly thinking about horror movies, because there's not that many horror TV shows. There's a ton of horror novels, but aside from like Stephen King and Clive Barker and also a ton of reviews, there's not that many sort of like mainstays, Peter Straub and all that kind of stuff. And even that was of an era. There was an era where like horror prose was like the hot thing, and then it kind of wanes from there. So we're thinking about movies. And so when we're thinking about movies, there is a little bit of like, these characters are safe because they're stars, and they, and all that kind of stuff. And it is one of the liberating things about comics, where you don't really know like who got paid the most to be on that screen. Yeah. So like, so anyone can kind of be vulnerable, and you can kind of really play into it. Like, I think one of the things about, doing horror comics specifically is learning that there are specific things you can do on the page in horror, on a comics page in horror, that you can't do in other medium, and leaning into it. Like, it is a very classic thing to shroud your scares in shadow, and like the things that you can't see is more scary than things that you can see. But when you look at someone like Junji Ito, you realize like, some of his scares are very explicit. They're very graphically explicit, and it kind of goes 100% against what you think about in horror, because what we think about as horror is live action. And in my opinion, when you see something too clearly in live action, you see the artifice of it all. But there's something about how we animate comics imagery in our head that we can take a super articulate image done with the right person in the right way, and it becomes scarier because we see it in all of its detail, as opposed to not seeing it in all of its detail. So there's little things like that I feel like, in comics, we can, that is the exciting bit to me, is as we're seeing all these comics, horror comics coming out, I think people are seeing like, we don't have to just take the tricks from movies and live action. There are stuff that only comics can do that are scary, and let's lean into that.
Yeah, and the Sacred Damned has there's some like horror stuff in there, body horror specifically, that is really, really well done. I've never seen it talked about in other comics, and I'm like, all right, as like I don't want to give it away, but like as someone who has seen that, it's like, damn, that they wrote it really well. And like, I don't feel like there was never any punching down with something that very much could have been.
Well, I mean, it's got a great, like, Sabir Pirzada, he comes from, he's a screenwriter. He wrote for Moon Knight television show, Ms. Marvel TV show. He's done a bunch of uncredited writing for Marvel Studios. He was one of their go-to guys for a while. He, done some stuff for Lucasfilm, for Star Wars: The Bad Batch. Mm-hmm. He was the writer that, Marvel chose specifically to work with him on Villani, to co-write Ms. Marvel. So like, he was a writer in sort of high demand. And so he kind of brings all of that to the, he is such a talent. He, and then you pair him up with Eisner winning Micheal Walsh, who can really execute all the ideas that Sabir has. And it's just so, the two of them are such a powerhouse team. And that's a book too that I can't wait to see more of that. I so want there to be more in that. It's so effective what they're doing.
2 out of 2 right now. I'm not even a spy person, but one of our editors is. And like, as soon as I was finished I sent it to him on Slack and I was like, hey, you need to read this. Like, this is right up your alley.
That's awesome.
Now, sorry, I got the idea of, you were talking about like the differences between horror books versus what else you can do. Is something that fascinates me is the idea of a jump scare in a comic. And it's the closest you can get as a page turn. Right. So things like that I don't think work, and there's not many good slasher comics, but we'll get we could talk about that another time. Now, you were an editor. You weren't just an editor. You edited at Vertigo. Like you edited at one of the comics, like the epitome of like what comic, like pushing things and things like that. What do you think? What is the biggest takeaway from being an editor before you were a writer as you are now, like to the point where you're at? What have you learned as an editor that is your biggest superpower as a writer?
Oh God, that's so tough to say, because I feel like editing informs everything I do as a writer. So it's hard to isolate one piece of it. I some random things that sort of pop up is, I think a lot about, when I'm developing a book, I think a lot about who my audience is. I think sometimes when people develop books, they're just like, oh, I want to write this, or this is cool. And then they sort of put that book out. And some of those work and some of those die on the vine. And I think one of the things that being an editor kind of brought me is the perspective. As an editor, I have so much on my plate. What I would love is anything that makes my life easier. And most of the time, if I'm working with a creative team, I want that creative team to succeed. If a project doesn't go, it's not because I don't want it to go. It's because I can't argue it to my boss. So having a pitch or a concept that does that work for me is very helpful. And sometimes what does that work for me is saying, hey, in this concept is an implicit audience. Right. So like for something like Infidel, it was, hey, here's a horror audience. And at the time, I remember saying like, horror is a huge thing in film with very dedicated, and we barely touch it in comics. So like, let's go after that horror audience. And then on top of that, it was a multiracial audience where we talk about that stuff. Those are two very big pockets, and let's target those specifically. The Good Asian was about crime noir, but it was also about the Asian community. Let's target those specifically. And it doesn't sort of have to be that, it doesn't have to, be along of race and ethnicity, but like things where you kind of get the picture, like, oh, I know who picks up this book. That is very, very helpful when you're pitching a book. And that's something I think about when I'm writing. It's just like, okay, who's this book for? And not just in the loose sense, but specifically who's going to get up and like talk about it to all their friends.
Yeah.
And then from there, you get enough of those people and other people will kind of come and want to hear, want to talk about it as well.
Power of word of mouth.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about a lot of big things, but you wrote we started with the Green Arrow, which was a tie-in to a giant multiverse, like a reset for the DC universe.
Yes.
Absolute Power is pretty much the same thing, and you were working on Task Force 7. Now, what is it like going from doing something like this or doing something like The Good Asian or like Man's Best, going to a tie-in book for a gigantic superhero event?
One of the things I find, I don't know if I'm unique to this, but it surprises me at least, is that coming from the stuff that I do where everything is isolated and siloed and all that kind of stuff, when I get to work in another universe, I really love tying into as many different things as I can. Like even when I did Dead Boy Detectives, that tied into James Tynian's, The Glass House, his Corinthian book. I like, if I'm going to be in the shared universe, I want to make the most of the shared universe as much as I can. So I try to tie it into things. I try to make sure all the characters, it connects with last time you saw those characters and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, I got to give it to I do not make it easy for my editors because they're constantly pulling reference. If you've read my issue of Task Force 7, there's a double page spread in there where you have characters that are like barely an inch big, but a poor editor had to go and be like, okay, what was their last appearance? What do their costumes look like? And it's filled with them and all that kind of stuff. And I love like little things like that. So
that's how I wanted to end the interview because I have a question about.
Okay.
As I said, I was someone who started during Flashpoint, and then the New 52 happened, and I bought all of those as well because it was like. I want to be into this thing from the start. Like DC is where my heart and soul, that's where all of this started at.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Voodoo. Holy shit, what a pull. Please tell me where that came. Like, what made you be like, I want to bring Voodoo back? Because awesome, love her, but.
Okay, so not only, and this is also like when we talk about the little Easter eggs and all that kind of, not only did I bring Voodoo, because I don't think anyone sort of mentioned this online, because I leave these Easter eggs mostly for myself, but there's a scene in that where there's like, oh, we got a bunch of like, technology or weaponry from like Halo Corporation. And so the weapons they have are like Wildcat's wet works, like weapons. So like at one point, Ms. Martian has like Zealot's sword and they're firing guns that are the Wetworks guns, and the Ray has Grifter's blasters. Like it's all like those tiny little Easter eggs. Yeah, all these tiny little Easter eggs. I was like, is anyone else going to notice that but me? But I skipped reference to all that, and Claire like knocked it out of the park. Like if you look at there's a shot in that comic where the Ray is like shooting his blasters. That's specifically a callback to Jim Lee doing Grifter, shooting. I think probably Wildcats 1 or Wildcats 2. Like it's just like these very like obscure Wildstorm callbacks. And part of what I liked about that was just like, because it is one of those like end of the world crossovers, I liked like, what's the most ragtag team we can kind of bring together? So, we've got we've got the Ray, who's a teen hero who's got Golden Age ties. You got Ms. Martian, who's sort of a young hero, but like more from the modern sort of silver sort of age. And then let's do someone from Wildstorm. Like, how can we make it the most hodgepodge,
See
all
we
people
get in
sort
there.
of all together. Yeah. If I could have worked in like a New 52 character, like I actually think my first draft had a New 52 character, but then we had the cast was too big, but then also like they wouldn't have had powers because of the nature of the event, and it didn't make sense. So I was like, okay, we'll stop that. But like the more random people I could have thrown in there, the better for me.
The New 52, like the books that were like left field, New 52, like Voodoo, one of my personal favorite characters of all time, Resurrection Man.
Nice.
Like,
oh yeah.
Those seeing those characters pop up, I always pop. I'm like, that's the shit. That's what I want.
There is something like, I think reading these shared universes, there is a very specific joy of just like this random character that maybe you saw in a Who's Who, or maybe you saw an official guide to the Marvel Universe, and just seeing them on the screen in the panel doing stuff. You're like, oh my God, Like, I feel seen.
Yeah. You're like, oh shit. Somebody else remembered that guy?
Yeah. No, like, oh wow, Slipknot's in this issue. Like, who remembers Slipknot?
Yeah, but Voodoo was just like, this fucking rules. Like, I missed her. I don't even know what her last appearance was since her series.
She was, because I've done research on all this.
Yes, tell me where she was.
So Matt Rosenberg and Steve Segovia did a 12-issue Wildcat series. And she sort of pops in through that, where they don't really nail down what her powers are, which I actually think is a good, like, works for the character and works for that book. So that was part of the fun with that character. It's like, oh, I don't actually know what she does anymore. So let's how do we handle that sort of like sleight of hand?
That rules. Well, thank you for putting Voodoo in a book. Everything else, that's cool, but like Voodoo, thanks. Trying to make comics more diverse, like make sure people feel seen. All of that's awesome, but Voodoo.
Yeah, I know Voodoo's good there. Yeah.
Voodoo. But thank you for chatting with me. Okay, what should people be picking up? What are the 5 names of the books?
Yes. So, I mean, they're all going to be branded with this sort of the Horizon experiment. Mm-hmm. There is the Manchurian, which comes out September 25th. There is the Manchurian comes out September 25th. Sacred Dam that comes out October 23rd. There's Moondogs that comes out November 20th. And then I think Motherfucking Monsters. Oh, well, we haven't solicited that yet. So, but those 3, but the easiest thing to do is just go to a comic book store and tell them you want all the Horizon experiment one-shots. And like I said, like, for every book, pre-orders are important, but for these books specifically, pre-orders are the most important thing. You know, we don't have we're going to collect all this in a trade come April, but the data we get from the trade sales isn't going to tell us which of the books people respond to more than others. Yeah. So like it's pre-orders is really going to tell the tale, you know, getting those pre-orders numbers up, you know, all that sort of stuff. That's going to be like, is more of this stuff going to happen or not?
So please pre-order these books. They are all incredible.
Thank you.
I can't speak for the 3 that I haven't gotten to read yet, but from what I've seen, everything, and I fully trust all these teams are fucking Skylar Partridge, like always out of the park. Vita always out of, like there's so many cool names here. People who aren't usually doing comics, like please give these books a chance. And then where can people find you?
People can find me. I am real_Pornsak on Twitter, real_Psack on Instagram, and just Pornsak on Blue Sky. I'm one of those people that make it absolutely annoying and with a different name in every platform.
You did all 3 of them very differently.
Yeah, very differently. It was not intentional. So a small piece of trivia is that you cannot have a syllable porn on an Instagram handle, which is one of the things I found. So so I did not have the option of doing real porn. I meant to do the same thing, and so did not have that option on Instagram. And then on Blue Sky, there was no other Pornsak on there. It's like, I've always wanted to have like my handle be just Pornsak, my first name. And yeah, so I had to do that. But now it is the most complicated thing.
Yeah, I'm very lucky that no other Dan McMahon was smart enough to say Dan the McMahon. So I took that everywhere.
Nice.
So when new things pop up, I'm like, that's mine.
That's yours. You got it.
I gotta get there first. You can find us at gatecrashers.fan, where we do all of your reviews, interviews, essays, all that good stuff. And you can find us the next time we put out an episode. Cool. Thank you. The Gatecrashers.